Let them die. I'd rather bury the whole team than watch that woman come back. Colonel Bradley Vance said it out loud in a room full of officers, while 22 Rangers screamed for help through the speakers. Then he reached out and killed the feed with one finger, cutting off their voices mid-plea. He'd erased Madison Carter, once signed her discharge, shredded her name, smiled while he did it. Now he was ready to let 22 men burn on a mountain just to keep her buried. He thought he'd won. He thought she was gone. He forgot one thing. Madison Carter was still the deadliest shot the Army ever trained, and she was already moving. Before we go on, if you believe a person's worth isn't printed on a uniform, take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel. Follow Madison's story all the way to the end. It gets bigger than you think. And do me a favor, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Madison's story travels tonight. Now let's begin. For 7 long years, everyone at Fort Carson believed that Captain Madison Carter was a forgotten failure. That was the story they told. That was the story they wanted told. And in the Army, the story that gets repeated often enough eventually becomes the truth, whether it's true or not. The younger soldiers, the ones who arrived after her, only knew her as a rumor, a cautionary tale whispered in the mess hall. You hear about that woman sniper, the one who cracked under pressure, best shot they ever had, and she just fell apart. That was the version they knew. That was the version somebody made sure they'd know. But the men and women who had actually served beside her never said it. They went quiet whenever her name came up. They looked at the floor. They changed the subject. Because the ones who knew Madison Carter knew that the rumor was a lie built on top of a lie, and they were too afraid of the people who built it to say so out loud. Madison had been, without argument, one of the most gifted snipers the United States Army had produced in a generation. Instructors used to bring other students to watch her shoot, not to teach her anything, but to show them what it looked like when someone was simply better. She had a stillness that couldn't be trained into a person, a patience that felt almost inhuman. She could lie in one position for 11 hours without moving a muscle, breathing slow, waiting. And when the moment came, she never wasted it. And then one day her name vanished from the records. Not quietly reassigned, not honorably retired, erased. Her commendations were pulled, her scores were scrubbed, her file was reduced to a single cold line that told everyone exactly what they were supposed to think, a talented soldier who could not handle the pressure. That was the lie. The truth was uglier, and the truth was this. Madison Carter had walked into an office one afternoon and reported something she had witnessed with her own eyes. A senior officer abusing his position, covering his tracks, and putting soldiers in danger to protect his own reputation. She reported it the way she'd been trained to. Up the chain, by the book. She believed the system would do what the system was supposed to do. The system chose silence instead of justice. Within a month, the officer she had reported was promoted. And within that same month, Madison Carter was gone. They didn't just take her rank, they took her name. They took the 7 years she'd bled for, and they left her standing in a parking lot with a cardboard box and a discharge that branded her forever as weak. Now, all these years later, Madison lived quietly in Colorado in a small town at the foot of the mountains, teaching civilians how to shoot at a range off the highway. She taught nervous first-time gun owners how to hold a pistol without shaking. She taught hunters how to steady their breath. She taught teenagers who thought they knew everything that they knew nothing at all. And every one of them at some point would ask her the same question. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? And every time Madison would give the same answer. A small shrug, a tight, almost smile, and 2 words. Around. She never told them. She never talked about the Army. She had folded that part of herself up and put it in a box in the back of her mind. And she had made peace, she told herself, with never opening it again. She was wrong about that. Because on a cold October night, when the wind was coming down off the mountains and rattling the windows of her little house, the box was about to be torn wide open by a phone call she never expected to receive. The phone rang a little after 11. Madison was awake, sitting at her kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink because sleep didn't come easy to her anymore, and it never really had. She looked at the number. She didn't recognize it. She almost didn't answer. But something in her, some old instinct that had never fully gone to sleep, told her to pick it up. Carter, she said, just her last name, an old habit that had never left. There was a pause on the line, a breath, and then a voice she hadn't heard in 7 years. Madison, it's Daniel. She went very still. Colonel Daniel Hayes, her old mentor, the man who had trained her, shaped her, believed in her when nobody else could see what he saw. The man who had stood in a hearing room 7 years ago and tried to defend her and had been told in no uncertain terms that if he kept pushing, his career would end right alongside hers. He hadn't kept pushing, and Madison had never forgiven him for it. Not completely. Daniel, she said, her voice was flat, careful. It's late. I know what time it is. His voice was rough, tired, and there was something underneath it she hadn't heard from him before. Fear. Daniel Hayes did not get afraid. She'd seen the man stay calm under mortar fire, but he was afraid now. I need you to listen to me. I don't have long, and I shouldn't even be making this call. Then why are you making it? Because 22 Rangers are going to die tonight, he said, and you're the only person on this earth who can stop it. Madison closed her eyes. For a long moment, she didn't say anything at all. The kitchen was silent except for the wind against the glass and the slow, steady beat of her own heart, which had not sped up, not even a little. That was the thing about her. Even now, even after everything, the world could tell her that 22 men were about to be slaughtered, and her heart stayed calm. That calm had been a gift once. Then it had been a curse. Now she didn't know what it was. You've got the wrong number, Daniel, she said quietly. I teach hunting safety to accountants now. I'm not that person anymore. You're exactly that person, and he said. You never stopped being that person. They just told you that you did. That landed harder than she wanted it to. Tell me what's happening, she said, and he did. He told her fast in the clipped shorthand of a man who had done 100 briefings and knew there wasn't a wasted word to spare. A ranger team, 22 men, sent into a remote mountain region in northern Afghanistan to rescue 2 American intelligence officers who'd been captured by hostile forces. A routine extraction on paper. Get in, get the officers, get out. It had gone wrong from the first minute. They walked into a trap, Daniel said. Somebody knew they were coming. Somebody was waiting. Their vehicles are down, 2 of them burning. They've got wounded. They're pinned in a low position with high ground on 3 sides, and the enemy's got numbers we can't even count. 40, 50 fighters, maybe more, and they're closing the ring. Air support, Madison said. Weather's socked in, nothing's flying. Not a helicopter, not a drone, nothing. And the nearest quick reaction force is 4 hours out over bad terrain. His voice cracked just slightly. Madison, those boys have got maybe 90 minutes before that ring closes, and it's over. And there is nothing the United States Army can put over that ridge in time. Then what do you want from me? I'm in Colorado. I can't reach across the world and pull a trigger. You don't have to reach across the world, Daniel said. There's a piece of this you don't know yet. And here his voice changed, dropped lower. Careful now, the way a man gets careful when he's about to say something he's not supposed to say. There's an asset in position, he said. A concealed overwatch site above that valley. Good ground, the best ground. It was set up for a completely different operation. And then that operation got scrubbed, so the site's just sitting there empty with a rifle and a full kit and a clean line down into that whole valley. Every enemy position, every firing angle, all of it. Madison frowned. Then put a shooter in it. We don't have one, Daniel said, and the shame in his voice was thick enough to touch. The shooter who was supposed to be there got pulled for the scrubbed op. The men we've got left in range aren't qualified for that distance, that angle, that wind. It's a 1,000-yard problem, Madison. It's worse than 1,000 yards. And there is exactly one person I have ever met in 30 years who could take that shot in that wind at that range, blind cold first round, and not miss. He paused. You know who that is? Madison stood up. She didn't remember deciding to stand. She just found herself on her feet, one hand flat on the kitchen table, staring at nothing. That's not possible, she said. You can't put me on a rifle in Afghanistan from a kitchen in Colorado. I'm not going to, Daniel said. There's a base 90 minutes from you, a private field. There's a plane fueling on the tarmac right now that can get you where you need to be, and I have burned every favor I have ever been owed, and a few I haven't, to make that plane exist. If you say yes, if you walk out your door in the next 10 minutes, I can get you into position before that ring closes. It's tight. It's insane. But it's possible if you go right now. Madison laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. You want me to fly into a war zone? For an army that told the whole world I was too broken to serve. Yes, give me one reason. And Daniel Hayes, who had failed her once and hated himself for it every day since, gave her the only reason that mattered. Because those 22 boys don't care what your file says, he told her. They're not going to die knowing your discharge paperwork. They're going to die scared and cold on a mountain thinking their country forgot about them. And you know exactly what that feels like, being forgotten, being left behind by the people who were supposed to have your back. His voice broke fully now. Don't let it happen to them, Madison. Don't let them feel what you felt. You're the only one who can make sure they don't. The kitchen was silent, and in that silence, something in Madison Carter that had been sleeping for 7 years opened one eye. Who's in charge of that base, she said. The one with the plane. There was a pause. That's the part I need to tell you, Daniel said slowly, and it's the part that's going to make you want to hang up on me. Say it. The officer coordinating this whole thing from the command center. The one who has to sign off on you even setting foot on that base. Daniel took a breath. It's Vance. Madison went cold. Bradley Vance, now a full colonel. The man who had signed the paper. The man who had told her nobody would remember her name by Christmas. The officer she had reported all those years ago, the one who had abused his position and buried the evidence and buried her right along with it. He was the one running this operation. He was the one she'd have to walk past to save those men. Of course it's him, she said softly, and she almost laughed again because of course it was. Of course the universe would make her walk right back into the arms of the man who destroyed her. He doesn't want you there, Daniel said. He fought it. When I said your name, he lost it. Said he'd rather lose the whole team than see you get so much as a footnote of credit. Those were his words, Madison. He would rather 22 Rangers die than watch you come back. And there it was. That was the thing that decided it. Not the 22 men, though they mattered. Not Daniel's guilt, though she heard it. It was that one obscene fact that Bradley Vance would rather let good men die than let her be right about herself. Madison walked to the closet by her front door. She opened it, and on the top shelf in the back was a box she hadn't touched in 7 years. Give me the coordinates for the base, she said, and her voice had changed. It was lower now, steadier, sharper. It was the voice of the soldier they thought they'd erased. And Daniel, you listen to me now because I'm only saying this once. If I do this, if I get on that plane, I am not doing it for the Army. And I am sure as hell not doing it for Vance. I am doing it for those 22 men and for one other reason. Name it. So that when this is over, that man has to stand in a room full of people who thought I was a coward and admit out loud that the soldier he threw away is the only reason those Rangers came home. Daniel let out a long shaking breath. That's my girl, he said. That's the Carter I trained. 90 minutes to the base, she said. Text me the gate code. I'm already moving. She hung up. She reached up and pulled the box down from the shelf. Inside was a photograph, face down, of a younger woman in uniform standing straight, unbroken, proud. Madison didn't look at it, not yet. She had a plane to catch and a promise to keep and a war to win from 10,000 feet up. She grabbed her keys and walked out into the cold. The drive to the airfield should have taken 2 hours. Madison did it in 90 minutes flat, headlights carving through the black mountain roads, her hands loose on the wheel and her mind already somewhere else. Already on the ridge, already doing the math. Wind, distance, elevation, temperature. The problem was assembling itself in her head like it had never left because it never had. And somewhere around the halfway point, she realized her hands weren't shaking and hadn't been not once. And she felt a strange grief at how easily it all came back. 7 years of trying to be a normal person gone in 90 minutes on a dark road. The airfield was little more than a strip of concrete in a hangar with one light on. When she pulled up, the gate was open the way Daniel had promised. A young airman was waiting by a small, fast jet with its engines already turning, and he snapped to something when he saw her, not quite a salute because she wasn't in uniform and had no rank to salute, but something close, some instinct, as if his body recognized what she was, even if his brain didn't have a name for it. Ma'am, he said, half shouting over the engines, are you the shooter? Madison looked at him. He was so young, 20 maybe, the same age as the men dying on that mountain. I'm the shooter, she said. Relief flooded his face. Thank God, we didn't nobody would tell us who was coming. There were people saying nobody was coming at all. There was this colonel on the line saying we should scrub it, that it wasn't worth it. His name Vance. The airman blinked. Yes, ma'am. How'd you? Doesn't matter. She climbed the short stairs into the jet. Get me in the air. The flight was a blur of noise and dark, and the churning of an engine pushed to its limit. Daniel had arranged a relay, a chain of aircraft refueling in the air, a series of favors and unofficial arrangements that Madison suspected would end more than one career if anyone ever wrote it down. She didn't ask questions. She strapped in, closed her eyes, and did the thing she was best at in all the world. She got quiet. She let the fear that a normal person would feel should feel settled to the bottom of her, and she went still on top of it. She ran the shot in her mind 1,000 times. She didn't know the exact wind yet. She didn't know the exact distance, but she knew the shape of the problem, and she turned it over and over, warming it up, waking up the part of her brain that solved it. And somewhere over the ocean, a voice came through her headset, a voice she knew, a voice she hated. Carter. Cold. Clipped. Bradley Vance. He'd gotten himself patched into the aircraft's comms. Of course he had. You listen to me. I don't know what strings Hayes pulled to put you on that plane, but let me be crystal clear about something. You are not back. You are not reinstated. You are a civilian contractor being used for a single shot because we've run out of options. And the moment this is over, you go right back to being nothing. Are we clear? Madison opened her eyes. Colonel Vance, she said calmly, how's your career? Silence on the line. Last I heard you made full bird, she went on. Congratulations. It's amazing what a man can accomplish when he buries the one person who could prove what he really is. She paused. Tell me something. When those 22 boys die, are you going to feel it? Or did you kill that part of yourself years ago, right around the time you signed my discharge? Nobody's dying, Vance snapped. The QRF will reach them. The QRF is 4 hours out, and they've got 90 minutes. You know that. Daniel knows that. Everybody in that command center knows that. The only reason I'm on this plane is that you did the math and realized that if they die and it comes out that you refused the one asset who could have saved them, they'll bury you the way you buried me. Her voice was soft and merciless. That's the real reason you let me come, isn't it? Not to save them, to save yourself. The silence on the line was so long she thought he'd cut the connection. Then low and venomous Vance said, You always did think you were smarter than everyone in the room. No, Madison said, I just wasn't willing to lie. That's all it ever was, and you couldn't stand it. She reached up and pulled the comms cord, cutting him out of her ears. She had a shot to prepare for, and she was done listening to dead men talk. The insertion was rough. A helicopter, one of the only birds that could fly a low-sheltered route under the weather, dropped her on a shoulder of the mountain well back from the valley and lifted away into the dark. From there, it was on foot. Madison moved up through the cold and the thin air with a rifle case on her back and a kit she'd checked and rechecked, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt entirely, completely herself. She wasn't a shooting instructor. She wasn't a discharged captain. She wasn't a roomer in a mess hall. She was a sniper moving to her hide, and everything else was noise. She reached the Overwatch site with 20 minutes to spare. And when she settled into position and brought the valley up in her scope for the first time, her breath caught not from fear, but from the sheer terrible clarity of what she was seeing. Below her, in a shallow bowl of rock, in broken vehicles, 22 men were fighting for their lives. She could see them, small, exhausted, running low. She could see the muzzle flashes of their return fire growing more spaced out, more desperate. She could see the wounded dragged into what little cover there was. And above them, all around them, she could see the enemy dug into the high ground, patient, methodical, tightening the noose one position at a time. They were minutes from being overrun, and they had no idea that 1,000 yards away and 500 feet up in the cold and the dark, the woman the army had thrown away had just gone prone, chambered around, and started to breathe slow. Down in that bowl, Captain Ethan Walker was screaming into a radio that wasn't answering. This is Ranger Element. We are combat ineffective. We have wounded. We need support. Does anyone copy over? He let go of the transmit button and slammed his fist against the rock. Beside him, his radio operator was already dead. 21 now. He'd have to remember that. 21 and himself made 22, and he was watching that number get smaller with every minute, and there was not one single thing he could do about it. He'd led these men in. He was going to watch them die here. That was the truth he was living inside of, and it was eating him alive. 10 feet away, Sergeant Ryan Mitchell was doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was refuse to quit. He was crouched over two wounded men, firing controlled bursts up at the ridgeline, buying seconds, buying feet, buying anything he could buy with the little ammunition he had left. "Stay with me," he kept saying to the wounded, to himself, to God. "Stay with me. We are not done. We are not done." And beside him on her knees in the dirt with blood on her hands that wasn't her own, their medic. Emily Brooks was making the kind of decisions no 24-year-old should ever have to make. Who she could still save, who she couldn't. She'd stopped crying an hour ago. She didn't have the water to spare for tears. "I need morphine. I need Ryan. I'm out of everything." "Then keep his head down and keep him breathing," Mitchell said. "That's all we can do now." Walker crawled over to them, low, staying under the fire. "How many can move on their own?" Brooks looked at him with hollow eyes. "6, maybe 7. The rest we carry or we leave." "We don't leave anybody," Walker said. "Then we all die here, sir, because we cannot carry 7 men up that slope under that fire." "We don't leave anybody," Walker's voice cracked, and then quieter, broken. "We don't leave anybody. That's the whole job, Brooks. That's the only thing I've got left to give them. I couldn't keep them safe, but I'm not leaving a single one of them on this rock." And that was the moment the enemy commander up on the high ground decided the game was over. He gave the order, and all along the ridgeline, the fighters who had been picking at the Rangers for hours rose up to finish it. A final push. A wave. The machine gun that had been pinning them down opened up at full rate, chewing the rock over their heads, and the fighters began to move down the slope, closing seconds away now. And then the machine guns stopped. Not paused, stopped, mid-burst. Cut off in a way that made no sense, followed by a single flat crack that rolled down from somewhere high and far away, a sound that arrived a full second after the gun went silent, the way a sound does when it comes from very, very far off. Mitchell froze. He knew that sound. Every shooter knew that sound. That was not a rifle in the valley. That was a rifle a long, long way away. "What was that?" Brooks whispered. Mitchell didn't answer. He was staring up at the ridgeline where the machine gun had been, where a second ago there had been a gunner methodically killing them, and where now there was just silence and a body slumped over a dead weapon. Then a second crack rolled down the mountain, and on the opposite ridge, a fighter who had been flanking their escape route, the one man perfectly positioned to cut off their only way out, simply fell. "Somebody's shooting for us," Mitchell breathed. He grabbed Walker's arm. Captain, somebody is shooting for us. That's an American gun. That's Overwatch, sir. Somebody's up on the high ground shooting for us." Walker stared up at the mountains, at the dark, at the impossible. "There's nobody out there," he said. "There's nobody left. Command told us we were on our own. There is nobody." The third crack. And 100 meters up the slope, the fighter who had risen to lead the final charge, the enemy commander himself, the man who had just given the order to overrun them, pitched backward into the rocks and did not get up. The wave faltered. The fighters who a moment ago had been seconds from swarming down into the bowl suddenly didn't know where death was coming from. Their gunner was dead. Their flanker was dead. Their commander was dead. And there was no sound of an aircraft, no rotor wash, no drone, just that flat, patient crack rolling down out of the black mountains every time one of them lifted his head. They started looking for the shooter. They couldn't find her. Up in her hide 1,000 yards and 500 feet above the valley, Madison Carter worked. The bolt breathed out slow and found her next target through the scope. Her heart was calm. Her hands were still. The wind was in her bones. And for the first time in 7 years, she was precisely where she was supposed to be. "All right, boys," she said quietly to no one, to the 22 men below who had no idea she existed. "Let's get you home." Down in the command center, 10,000 miles away, Colonel Bradley Vance stood frozen in front of a bank of monitors, staring at the drone feed that had just barely punched through a gap in the weather. Watching enemy positions go dark one after another, and he felt something he had not felt in 7 years. He felt afraid, because he knew that shooting. He'd seen it once before years ago on a range when a young captain had made a shot that no one else in the Army could make, and he'd realized in that moment that she was better than him at the one thing he thought made him great. That was the day he'd started to hate her. That was the day the whole thing had really begun. Beside him, Colonel Daniel Hayes watched the same feed, and for the first time in 7 years, the old man was smiling. "You wanted to scrub it," Daniel said quietly, not taking his eyes off the screen. "You wanted to let those men die rather than let her come back." Vance said nothing. "Watch Bradley," Daniel said, bone. "Watch what the soldier you threw away can do, and then figure out what you're going to tell all those people you lied to." On the screen, another enemy position went dark. And on a cold mountain in northern Afghanistan, 22 Rangers who had made peace with dying began slowly to understand that they were going to live saved by a shot in the dark from a ghost. They couldn't see a soldier with no name, no rank, and nothing left to lose except the one thing they'd never managed to take from her: the truth of who she really was. The fourth crack rolled down the mountain and another enemy position went silent. Down in the bowl, Sergeant Ryan Mitchell counted the seconds between the shots, and what he was counting told him something that made the hair stand up on the back of his neck. Every shot was landing. Not near, not close, landing. Whoever was up there in the dark wasn't spraying suppression to make the enemy nervous. They were killing one man at a time, and they hadn't missed once. "Captain," he said, crawling to Walker through the dirt. "Whoever that is, they're not walking their shots in. First round every time. You understand what I'm telling you? Nobody does that. Nobody in the world does that at this range, in this wind in the dark." Ethan Walker didn't answer right away. He was staring up at the black shoulder of the mountain, at the place the shots kept coming from, and he was trying to make himself believe it was real. An hour ago, he had accepted that he was going to die on this rock with his men. He had made his peace with it. And now something impossible was reaching down out of the dark and pulling that peace apart. And hope was the most dangerous thing a dying man could feel, because if it turned out to be wrong, it would break him worse than the dying ever could. "Don't," he said quietly. "Sir, don't do that to them," Walker said, nodding toward the wounded, toward Brooks, toward the exhausted men still firing up the slope. "Don't tell them somebody's coming until we know it's true. I watched Hope kill better men than me. If this is a fluke, if that shooter runs out of ammo or gets found in the next 2 minutes, and I let these boys start believing they're going home." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "Just keep fighting, that's all. Keep fighting, and let's see what the mountain does." But the mountain wasn't finished. 10,000 miles away in a command center that had gone dead silent, Colonel Bradley Vance stood in front of the drone feed and watched the same thing Walker was watching, and he understood it faster because he had seen it before. He had seen it 15 years ago on a range at Fort Benning, when a young officer nobody had heard of lay down behind a rifle and did something to a set of targets that made 2 decades of shooters stop talking and just stare. He had been there. He had felt the thing he felt now, a cold, sick jealousy, the specific hatred of a man who has spent his whole life being the best in the room and suddenly discovers he isn't and never was. That day had started everything. And now that same shooting was coming down off a mountain in Afghanistan, and Bradley Vance knew with total certainty exactly who was behind that rifle. "Turn it off," he said. Nobody moved. "I said, turn off the feed." His voice climbed. "That's an unsecured relay. It's a security risk. I want it. Belay that." Colonel Daniel Hayes said it without raising his voice, and every head in the room turned, because Daniel outranked no one in that room but himself, and yet somehow in that moment he was the only one anybody was going to listen to. "The feed stays up. Every officer in this room is going to watch exactly what happens on that mountain tonight. Every single one." He turned his head slowly toward Vance. "Especially you." Vance's face went white, then red. "You have no authority." "I have a phone," Daniel said, "and on the other end of it is a soldier saving 22 American lives that you were ready to write off. You want to fight me on the feed, Bradley. You want that to be the thing you're remembered for. Go ahead, pick up the phone, tell her to stop. Tell her you'd rather the Rangers die." He held out an imaginary receiver. "Say it into a recorded line. I'll wait." Vance didn't take it. Of course he didn't. And in that refusal, every officer in the room saw something they would never be able to unsee. And the story of that night began to change before it was even over. Up on the ridge, Madison Carter had no idea any of that was happening, and she wouldn't have cared if she did. She had a target in her scope and a wind she was still learning, and nothing in the world existed except the space between the two. The wind was the enemy now, not the men below. They were just math. The wind was the thing trying to beat her. It came down the valley in gusts that shifted 3-4 times a minute, and every gust bent her bullet a little differently over that impossible distance, and she was reading it off the grass, off the dust, off the drift of smoke from the burning vehicles, holding all of it in her head at once, and updating it faster than she could have said out loud. This was the thing she had that no one else did. Not the eyesight, not the steady hands. Anyone could learn those. It was the ability to solve a problem with 100 moving parts in the half second before it changed, and to trust the answer with a man's life. She exhaled. She waited for the gust to top out and start to fall. She fired, and on the far slope, a fighter who had been low-crawling toward the Rangers' blindside, a man none of them had even seen, stopped crawling. 5. Down in the bowl, Emily Brooks felt it before she understood it. The fire coming down on them was thinning. An hour ago, there had been so many muzzle flashes on the ridgeline, she couldn't have counted them. Now there were gaps. Now there were places on the high ground that had gone dark and stayed dark. She had been so focused on the dying that she hadn't tracked the living, and now she looked up, really looked, and she saw it. "They're stopping," she whispered. Then louder, "Ryan, Ryan, they're stopping. The fire's coming off us." "I know," Mitchell said. "I know, keep your head down." "No, you don't understand. Look at the ridge. Half those positions are gone." A burst of enemy fire chewed the rock a foot from her head, and she flinched down, and Mitchell grabbed her by the collar and hauled her flat. "It's not over," he said fiercely right in her face. "You hear me? Not over. They're hurt, but they're not gone. One person can't kill 50 men, Emily. Whoever's up there, they're buying us time, and if we waste it sitting here celebrating that we die anyway. So I need you back on the wounded, and I need you moving, because the second that slope clears enough, we are going to carry every one of these boys out of here, and I need them stable enough to survive the trip." She stared at him. Then she nodded hard and went back to her hands, and the hope that had almost paralyzed her turned into fuel instead. That was Mitchell's gift. He couldn't shoot like the ghost on the mountain, but he could take a person on the edge of falling apart and give them something to do with their hands. And there is no medicine on earth more powerful than that. 20 minutes into the fight from the ridge, and Madison had cut the enemy's ability to press their attack in half. But she knew what was coming next because she always knew what was coming next. That was the other half of her gift. She didn't just react to the battlefield. She read it 3 moves ahead. And 3 moves ahead, she saw the problem. The enemy commander was dead. She'd killed him with her 3rd shot. But somewhere down there, someone new had taken over, someone smarter, and she could see it in the way the fighters had stopped charging and started thinking. They'd realized they were being shot from high ground to the northwest. They couldn't see her, but they could do geometry, and they were starting to peel men off the assault and send them wide up and around to get above her position and take the high ground away from her. If they got above her, it was over. Not just for her, for all of them. The one thing keeping those 22 men alive was her line down into that valley, and the moment she lost the high ground, that line was gone. She had maybe 10 minutes before the first of those flankers got into position. 10 minutes to break an enemy that outnumbered the men below her by more than 2 to 1. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay, think." And here's the thing about Madison Carter that the Army never understood. The thing they'd written off as coldness, as damage, as an inability to feel. When the situation got worse, she got calmer. Everyone else's fear went up. Hers went down. It was like the pressure had somewhere to go in other people and nowhere to go in her, so it just turned into clarity. It was the exact quality that made her the best sniper Daniel Hayes had ever trained. And it was the exact quality that made ordinary people find her unsettling. And it was in a terrible way the reason it had been so easy for Vance to convince the world she was broken. Because she didn't fall apart in front of them. And people distrust what they can't see break. She keyed the small radio Daniel had rigged for her, a back channel that ran through the relay and into his headset and only his. "Hayes, you there?" 10,000 miles away, Daniel pressed a hand to his ear and turned his back to the room. "I'm here. I'm watching." "Madison, I don't have words for what I'm watching." "Save it. I've got a problem. They've made my position. They're sending men wide to flank the high ground, northeast and southeast both. I count 2 elements, maybe 6 men each. I've got about 10 minutes before the first one crests and I lose my angle. When that happens, the men in the bowl are dead. Do you copy?" Daniel's stomach dropped. "Can you displace move to another hide? Not without losing my line for 4 or 5 minutes. They'll rush the bowl the second my fire stops. There's no good move here, Daniel. There's just the least bad one. She was quiet for a second. I can hold this position and take the flankers as they come, but that means letting the fighters in the valley regroup while I'm busy up top. Or I can keep working the valley and let the flankers reach me. Either way, something bad wins. What do you need from me? I need those rangers moving right now, not in 10 minutes. Now, while the valley's still suppressed and before the flankers get above me. Every second they sit in that bowl is a second closer to all of us losing. Can you get a message to their captain? There's no direct link to the ground team. Their comms are shot. We've been trying for. Then find one uses, Madison said, and for the first time her voice had an edge. Daniel, you called me. You put me on a plane. You told me not to let these boys feel what I felt. Well, I'm up here and I'm doing my part, and now I need you to do yours. Get them moving. She cut the channel and put her eye back to the scope because the first flanking element was already moving up the northeast slope, and she had shots to take. In the command center, Daniel Hayes turned around to a room full of officers who had heard his half of the conversation, and he did something that in 30 years of service he had never done. He raised his voice to the whole room. I need commo, and I need it in 60 seconds. That ground team has a down primary and a down secondary, but there is a ranger down there with a working handheld, or I'm not a soldier. Somebody find me a frequency, a relay, a satellite, a tin can, and a string. I don't care. 22 men live or die on whether we can tell them to move in the next minute. Move. The room exploded into motion, and on the ridge Madison fired. The lead man of the northeast element, the point man, the one picking the route for the rest, dropped in his tracks. The 5 behind him froze. Good. Freezing was what she wanted. A frozen man is a man not climbing. 6. She worked the bolt, found the second man, the one who'd taken a knee, and started scanning uphill, trying to find her, and she fired before he finished his scan. 7. Now the northeast element was pinned. They'd gone to ground behind rocks, and they'd stay there for a minute, maybe 2, before someone with courage or stupidity decided to move again. She'd bought 2 minutes. She spent them on the southeast element, instead swinging her rifle across the valley, and this was the part that separated her from every other shooter alive. The swing, the resolve a completely different distance and a completely different wind angle. Done in the time it took a normal person to blink, and the lead man of the southeast element went down before his own team even heard the shot that killed the northeast point. 25 minutes into her fight, and the flanking maneuver that was supposed to end her had stalled on both sides. But she couldn't hold 2 elements pinned forever from one rifle. The math was against her. She was one shooter, and the moment she was busy on the northeast, the southeast would climb, and the moment she turned back, the northeast would climb, and eventually one of them would crest and put a bullet in her back. She was buying minutes with a currency that was running out. She needed those rangers to move. Down in the bowl they were about to, because 60 feet from where Ethan Walker crouched, a young ranger named Cole Dawson, 19 years old on his first deployment, so scared he'd stopped feeling his hands an hour ago, was digging through the gear of a dead man, and his fingers closed around a handheld radio that everybody had assumed was destroyed. It wasn't. It was cracked. The screen was gone, but when he keyed it, a green light blinked. Sir, his voice broke like a boy's. Sir, I got a radio. It's got power, sir. Walker was across the dirt in a heartbeat. He grabbed the handheld, keyed it, and it hissed with static, and through the static, faint and broken, but real, a voice. Anger element, Ranger element, if you copy this, respond over. Ranger element. This is Ranger element? Walker nearly shouted it. This is Captain Walker, we copy. We are combat ineffective with multiple wounded. We need immediate. Say again, you're last over. The relief in the voice that came back was audible even through the static. It was a signals officer in the command center patched through 3 aircraft in a prayer. Ranger element, stand by for critical traffic. Do not repeat, do not wait for the QRF. You have friendly overwatch active on the high ground to your northwest. That overwatch is what's been killing the enemy for the last 25 minutes. Do you copy that? You have a friendly shooter, and that shooter is telling you to move now while you have suppression before the enemy retakes the high ground. Your window is minutes. Move now. How copy over? Walker went absolutely still. A friendly shooter. On the high ground. The impossible thing was true. He wasn't going to have to watch his men die. Somebody had come. But the thing that hit him hardest in the middle of everything was one detail that made no sense. Command, this is Walker. I copy your traffic. I copy move now, but say again, who is the Overwatch? Who's up there? We were told there was no support. We were told nobody was coming. Who is that on the mountain over? There was a pause on the line, a pause that lasted a second too long, and Walker would remember that pause for the rest of his life. Ranger Element, the voice said at last, and there was something strange in it now, something almost reverent. The identity of the Overwatch is, it's complicated, sir. Let's just say it's somebody the Army owes an apology to. Now move. Walker didn't understand it. He didn't have time to. He shoved the radio at Dawson, turned to his exhausted, bleeding men, and became in an instant the commander he'd been afraid he'd already stopped being. On your feet, he roared. We are moving. Al Mitchell, get the walking wounded up. 2-man carries on the litters. We go northwest up the draw. That's the covered route. Move. We do not stop. We do not leave anybody. Get up. And the bowl, which had been a place where men were waiting to die, became a place where men were fighting to live. And there is no more powerful thing in all the world than the moment a beaten unit decides it isn't beaten after all. Mitchell was everywhere at once, hauling men to their feet, pairing the strong with the wounded, snapping orders in the flat, hard voice that men obey without thinking. Brooks moved down the line of lecture, doing the last brutal triage, and this time when she said he can travel and he can't wait, she wasn't choosing who to abandon, she was choosing the order they'd carry them out. Cole Dawson, 19 and shaking, found himself with a wounded man's arm across his shoulders and discovered that terror and courage feel almost exactly the same from the inside, and that the only difference is whether you move. They came up out of the bowl in a ragged, desperate line, and the enemy in the valley saw them move and understood they were losing their prize, and the fire came back up hard. And on the ridge, Madison Carter saw the Rangers stand up, and she made a decision that would have gotten her killed if she'd been a fraction less than what she was. She abandoned the flankers. She turned her rifle away from the men climbing to kill her, away from the northeast, away from the southeast, and she put every round she had left into the valley, into the fighters rising up to cut the Rangers down as they climbed. Because that was the whole job. The flankers might reach her. She'd deal with that when it happened. But right now in this window, 22 men were exposed and moving, and the only thing standing between them and a massacre was her rifle. And she was never going to let those boys feel what she'd felt. She fired. 9. A fighter drawing down on the lead litter team dropped. She fired. On 10, the man behind him, the one who'd stepped up to take his place, dropped too. She was shooting faster now than the wind should have allowed, faster than the distance should have allowed, and she was still not missing. And down in the valley, the enemy simply could not understand how they were being torn apart from a place they couldn't see. And their attack, which had been so close to overrunning the bowl, began to come apart at the exact moment the Rangers needed it to. 11-12. But she was almost dry. She'd flown across the world with the kit that was staged in that hide, and it was a good kit, but it was not an infinite one. And she was down to her last handful of rounds, and up the northeast slope, the flanking element she'd abandoned had figured out she was busy, and they were climbing again fast now. And in 90 seconds, the first of them was going to crest the ridge behind her with a clear shot at her back. She knew it. She could feel the clock. And she did the math the way she always did the math, cold and fast and honest, and the math said she had enough rounds to save the Rangers, or enough time to save herself, but not both. She never even hesitated. She put her eye back to the scope and kept firing into the valley. 13. Down in the draw, Walker's line reached the first bend of covered ground, the first place the valley couldn't see them, and men who had been certain of death 10 minutes ago fell against the rock, gasping and alive. Mitchell counted heads, counted the litters, counted again. Captain. His voice cracked with something that wasn't fear for the first time all night. All present. We got everybody, sir. Every single one wounded and dead. We did not leave one man. We are all present. Walker put his hand against the cold rock and closed his eyes, and for 1 second let himself feel it. Every man, living and dead, not one left behind. The thing he'd promised, the only thing he'd had left to give them. Then his eyes snapped open because The job wasn't done because it was never done, and because somewhere up on that mountain, the person who'd made this possible was still out there. The Overwatch, he said, the shooter. We're covered now. They don't need to keep firing. Tell them to break contact. Tell them to get clear. He grabbed the radio from Dawson. Command Walker, we are in cover. We are all present. Tell your Overwatch to displace. Get them out of there, over. Up on the ridge, Madison heard none of it because in the last 30 seconds she had made a choice, and the choice was to spend her final rounds saving the last litter team as it crossed the open ground. And now the rifle was empty, and behind her clothes she heard the scrape of a boot on rock. The flankers had crested. She rolled. She came up with the pistol. Daniel had insisted she carry the pistol she'd almost left behind because she was a rifle shooter and had never in her life needed a sidearm. And there, 15 feet away, silhouetted against the dark, was a fighter raising his weapon at her. And she was out of time and out of distance and out of everything except the one thing they could never take. She fired first, 14. The man dropped, but there were more behind him. 5 more coming up the slope, and she had a pistol and a partial magazine against 5 rifles, and for the first time all night, the math finally truly ran out. This was where Madison Carter was going to die. On a mountain saving men who didn't know her name for an army that had thrown her away. And the strangest part, the part she'd never have been able to explain to anyone, was that she was at peace with it. Because dying up here doing this was worth 10 times more than the life they'd sentenced her to down below. If this was the end, it was a good end. It was her end, not the one Vance had written for her. She raised the pistol at the next shape coming up the slope, and the mountain above the flankers lit up. Not from her, from somewhere higher, somewhere behind and above the enemy, a controlled hammer of automatic fire came raking down the slope, and the 5 men climbing toward Madison were suddenly the ones caught in the open, the ones with nowhere to go, and they went down one after another under a gun they hadn't known was there. Madison spun pistol up hard, finally pounding, and through the dark she saw a shape moving down toward her. A soldier, American kid, moving with the speed and control of someone very, very good at this, and behind him, 2 more fanning out, clearing the slope. The lead man dropped beside her weapon, still up and scanning, and for a second, neither of them spoke. Then he turned his head, and in the thin light, she saw a face she didn't recognize, young, hard, streaked with dirt, and he looked at her the way you look at something you don't quite believe is real. Ma'am, he said, breathing hard. Staff Sergeant Reyes, 2nd Overwatch Element. Colonel Hayes sent us the second he realized you'd get flanked. We ran the whole ridge to get here. He glanced at the bodies on the slope, then at the empty rifle beside her, then back at her face, and something moved behind his eyes. We heard the shooting from a click out. Watched what you were doing through our optics the whole way in. He shook his head slowly. I've been doing this 8 years, ma'am. I have never seen anybody shoot like that. Not in training, not in combat, not anywhere. Who are you? And Madison Carter, lying on a cold mountain with an empty rifle and a nearly empty pistol, having just saved 22 men the Army had been ready to abandon, looked at this young sergeant who wanted to know her name, and she felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed shut for 7 years. Because for 7 years, nobody had asked. For 7 years, she'd been a rumor, a warning, a cautionary tale, a woman who couldn't handle the pressure. For 7 years, the answer to who are you had been someone else's lie. And now finally, someone was asking her directly. And she got to answer. She holstered the pistol. She looked the young sergeant in the eye, and she gave him the name they'd tried to erase. Carter, she said. Captain Madison Carter. And she watched his face change. She watched him recognize it, not the person, but the name, the rumor, the story he'd heard 100 times in 100 mess halls, the failed sniper, the woman who broke. She watched him hold that story up against the woman lying in front of him who had just done the most impossible shooting he'd ever witnessed, and she watched the 2 things refuse to fit together, and she watched him understand in real time that everything he'd been told was a lie. He stopped, started again. Ma'am, they said there's a story that I know what the story says, Madison said quietly. She pushed herself up to a sitting position, and her body screamed at her, and she ignored it. It's a lie, all of it. And in about 12 hours, a whole lot of people who've been telling that lie are going to have to explain why the failed sniper they threw away is the reason 22 Rangers came home tonight. She looked down at the valley at the draw where the men she'd saved were sheltering alive. Get me down to that team, Sergeant. I want to look them in the eye. And then I've got a phone call to make to a colonel who's about to have the worst morning of his life. 10,000 miles away in a command center gone silent, as a church, Colonel Bradley Vance stood in front of the drone feed and watched the second Overwatch element link up with the first, watch the flankers die on the slope, watch the enemy in the valley break and scatter into the dark, and watched at the bottom of the screen the small clustered shapes of 22 American Rangers alive safe whole, being pulled toward the extraction point that the QRF would reach in an hour to find nobody left to rescue because the rescuing was already done. He watched all of it, and he understood with a slow and total horror that it was over. Not the battle was won. What was over was the lie he had lived inside for 7 years. Because there were 40 officers in this room who had just watched Madison Carter do the impossible, and there was a recorded feed and there was a signals log with his voice on it saying, "Let them die," and there was no version of the morning coming where Bradley Vance walked out clean. Beside him, Daniel Hayes lowered his hand from his ear. He just heard Madison's voice faint through the relay, telling Sergeant Reyes her name. Captain Madison Carter, said out loud on an open channel to a soldier who would repeat it to everyone he ever met. The name Vance had spent 7 years bearing, spoken plain on the record in the middle of the most extraordinary act of soldiering anyone in that room had ever seen. Daniel turned to Vance, and he didn't gloat. He was too old and too tired and had carried too much guilt for too long to gloat. He just said very quietly so only Vance could hear. "She said her name Bradley, on the record, in front of everybody." He let that sit. "You spent 7 years making sure nobody would ever say it again. And she just said it herself on the best night of soldiering I've witnessed in 30 years of war." He shook his head slowly. "You can't bury it now. It's too big. It's too clean. 22 men and 40 witnesses and a recording. There's no hole deep enough for this one." Vance said nothing. His hands were shaking. He put them behind his back so no one would see. And down on the mountain, 10,000 miles away, Captain Madison Carter got to her feet, picked up her empty rifle, and started down the slope toward the men she had saved, toward the truth she had earned, and the reckoning she had waited 7 years to deliver. Madison came down off the ridge with Reyes ahead of her and 2 of his men behind, and every step down that slope felt heavier than the last, because the closer she got to those 22 men, the more real it became. Up on the mountain behind the rifle, it had all been math and wind and distance. Now she was walking toward the faces, toward the people the numbers had been standing for. And that was harder. It was always harder. They reached the draw where the Rangers had sheltered, and word had already run ahead of her. The signals officer had said it on the radio, "Friendly Overwatch," somebody the Army owes an apology to, and Reyes had said it into his own team net without thinking the name Captain Madison Carter. And a name like that spoken in a place like that travels faster than any bullet. By the time she came around the bend into the covered ground, 22 exhausted, bleeding, disbelieving men were already turning to look at her. And they didn't see what she expected them to see. She'd braced for it walking down. She'd braced for the flicker of recognition, the story clicking into place, the failed sniper, the woman who broke. She'd carried that story on her back for 7 years, and she'd expected to carry it down this mountain too. But these men didn't know the story, or they didn't care, because to them she wasn't a rumor from a mess hall. She was the thing that had reached down out of the dark and refused to let them die. She was the crack that rolled down the mountain every time death got close. She was to every single one of them the last face they'd expected to see, and the only one that mattered. Nobody said anything at first. They just looked at her. Then a young ranger, 19 years old, dirt and blood on his face, a dead man's radio still clutched in his hand, took a step toward her. Cole Dawson. And his voice when it came was the cracked, wrecked voice of a boy who had aged 10 years in one night. "Was that you?" he said. "Up on the mountain, all of it. Was that you, Madison looked at him. He was so young. Younger than she'd been when they'd put her behind her first rifle. Younger than the men she used to think of as kids. "That was me," she said. Dawson's face crumpled. He tried to say something and couldn't. He just stood there shaking. And then he did the only thing his body knew how to do, which was come apart, and Madison caught him by the shoulder before his knees went and held him up, this stranger, this child, while he shook. "I thought we were done," he brought out. I wrote a letter to my mom. I had it in my pocket. I thought we were all gonna die down there, ma'am. I had the letter ready. I know, Madison said quietly. I know you did. How does anybody shoot like that? In the dark. We couldn't even see the enemy. And you were, it doesn't matter how, she said. You're alive. That's the only part that matters. You keep that letter for a day you actually need it. Tonight's not that day. And around her, the rest of them were moving, now closing in. And it was the strangest thing because these were hard men. Rangers, some of them on their third and fourth deployments, and they came toward her the way people come toward something they can't quite believe is real. One of them, a big sergeant with a field dressing wrapped around his arm, reached out and just put his hand on her shoulder like he needed to touch her to confirm she existed. Another one said over and over, under his breath, thank you, thank you, thank you, not even to her exactly, just to the air, to God, to whoever was listening. And then Ethan Walker came through them. The men parted for him, and he stopped in front of Madison. And for a long moment, the captain who had been ready to go on that rock with his men just looked at the woman who had made sure he didn't have to. His face was a wreck of exhaustion and grief, and something that didn't have a name, the specific look of a man who has spent the last 2 hours certain he had failed everyone he was responsible for, and has just been told impossibly that he hadn't. I'm Captain Ethan Walker, he said. His voice was rough. I command this element, or what's left of it. He swallowed. I need you to understand something. When command told me there was overwatch on the high ground, I didn't believe them. I told my sergeant not to tell the men, because I'd already decided we were going to die up here, and I wasn't going to let false hope break these boys any worse than the dying would. His jaw worked. I was wrong. I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong. And I don't even know your Carter, she said, Madison Carter. And she watched it happen to him too, the name. She watched it land, watched him turn it over, and she saw the exact moment it connected to something. Because Walker was older than Reyes, older than Dawson, old enough to have been in when it happened, old enough to have heard the story back when it was fresh. Carter, he repeated slowly, and his eyes changed. I know that name. Years ago, there was a sniper at Benning. They used to talk about the best shot anybody'd ever. He stopped. His face did something complicated. And then there was a story that you washed out. Madison finished for him flat, couldn't handle the pressure, discharged. Yeah, that's the story. Walker looked at her. He looked at the empty rifle slung across her back. He looked up at the mountain she'd just come down from the mountain, where she'd done the impossible for 2 straight hours without missing. And then he looked back at her, and Madison watched a soldier's whole understanding of something rearrange itself behind his eyes. That's a lie, he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Madison said, it is. How much of it? All of it. Walker was quiet for a second. Then he said something that hit her harder than she was ready for. Whatever happened to you, he said, whoever did it, I've got 22 men here, living and dead, who are going home to their families because of a soldier the army told the whole world was a coward. And I am going to spend the rest of my career making sure everybody I ever meet knows the truth about what happened on this mountain. He straightened up, and even wrecked and exhausted and bleeding, there was something formal in it, something deliberate. You have my word on that, Captain. Ranger word. The whole world's going to know. And Madison, who had built a wall around herself 7 years ago and had lived behind it ever since, felt that wall take its first real hit. Because she hadn't come up here for this. She told herself she came for the 22 men and for the reckoning with Vance, and both of those were true. But she hadn't let herself want this. The thing she'd actually lost 7 years ago wasn't the rank or the career. It was this, being believed, being seen for what she actually was by people whose opinion meant something. And here was a ranger captain on a mountain giving it back to her. And she hadn't known until this exact second how much she'd needed it. She didn't cry, she never cried, but it was close, and she turned her face toward the valley so he wouldn't see how close. That was the moment the radio crackled. Dawson still had it, and it hissed and spat, and then Daniel Hayes' voice came through, thin and far away but unmistakable, and it was tight with an urgency that cut straight through the reunion. Ranger element? Ranger element, this is command. Be advised we have a problem. Say again, we have a problem. Get Captain Carter on this net immediately over. Every head turned. Madison crossed to Dawson in 2 steps and took the handheld. This is Carter. Go. Madison. Just her name and the way Daniel said it told her everything before he said another word. Something had gone wrong. Listen to me fast. That enemy force didn't break as clean as we thought. The drone caught movement, a truck with a heavy gun mounted, and it's coming up the valley road from the south. Fast. They must have had it in reserve. It's carrying maybe a dozen more fighters, and that gun will chew through cover like it's paper. It's headed straight for the draw you're sheltering in, and the QRF is still 40 minutes out. A pause. Madison, that gun reaches your position. Those men are back to where they were an hour ago. Worse. There's no high ground protecting you now. You came down off the mountain. The relief in the draw died. She felt it die around her, felt the 22 men who had just started to believe they were saved feel the floor drop out from under them again. Madison's mind was already moving, already ahead, already 3 moves down the road. Time to contact, she said. 6 minutes, maybe 7. It's moving fast on that road. 6 minutes. And she'd come down off the mountain. She'd given up the high ground to reach these men. The rifle on her back was empty. She had a pistol with half a magazine, and a truck with a heavy machine gun was 6 minutes away with a dozen fighters coming for men who had nothing left. She looked up the slope she'd just come down, back up at the ridge, at the high ground she'd abandoned. And she understood with a cold and terrible clarity exactly what she had to do and exactly what it was going to cook her. Reyes, she said, turning to the young sergeant, your Overwatch element. How much rifle ammo you carrying? Reyes read her face and went pale. Not enough for what you're thinking. We ran the ridge to reach you. We dumped weight. We've got maybe a partial load each. But ma'am, that road's 1,200 meters out. In a moving vehicle, that's a shot I can't. I know you can't, Madison said. That's why I'm going to make it. Give me your rifle. Reyes hesitated for 1 second. 1. And Madison watched him make the same calculation everyone made when they met her. The calculation that said, this is impossible, and then watched him look at the mountain behind her and remember that he'd just spent 2 hours watching her do the impossible over and over, and she watched him decide to believe. He unslung his rifle and put it in her hands. It's zeroed for me, he said. Not you. I don't know I'll figure it out on the first round, Madison said, checking the weapon with hands that knew it in seconds. A different rifle, a stranger's 0, and she'd have exactly 1 shot to learn it before it mattered. Walker, the captain stepped forward. Tell me what you need. I need to get back up on that ridge, and I need to do it in under 3 minutes, which means I'm going up in the fast way, not the safe way, and I'm going up alone because there's no time to bring anyone with me. When I'm up there, I'm going to try to kill that truck before it reaches you. If I can't, if I miss, if I run dry, if they get past me, you need a fallback. Is there any cover deeper in this draw? Anywhere that heavy gun can't reach? Walker turned to Mitchell, who'd been listening, and Mitchell was already nodding, already moving. 40 meters up the draw, it bends hard left behind a rock shelf. The gun can't get an angle on it. It's tight, but we can fit everybody wounded and all. Then that's your fallback, Madison said. The second you hear that truck, you get everybody behind that shelf and you stay there. If I do my job, you won't need it. If I don't, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Walker grabbed her arm as she turned for the slope. You're going back up there alone. Empty rifle, 1 loner, 1 shot to learn a stranger's 0 against a moving vehicle at 1,200 meters in the time it takes to run a slope that just about killed my men to come down. He searched her face. Tell me straight, what are the odds? Madison looked at him. Bad, she said, but I've made worse look easy, and these are my odds to spend, Captain, not yours. She pulled her arm free gently. Get your men behind that shelf. I'll take it from here. And she went up the slope. She went up it faster than she should have been able to. Faster than was safe, her lungs burning in the thin air. Her legs screaming, the loner rifle banging against her back, and every second she counted in her head, because she knew to the second how long she had, and she knew she was losing the race. She had come down this slope carefully protecting a knee she'd wrecked years ago, protecting a body that was 7 years older than the last time it did anything like this. Now she went up it like the 7 years didn't exist, like the knee didn't exist, like nothing existed except the ridgeline in the clock. Down in the draw, the Rangers heard it before they saw it. The low grinding growl of a diesel engine straining up the valley road, and under it worse the specific sound of men who knew they'd won once and were coming to win again. Move, Mitchell roared. Behind the shelf, everybody wounded first. Move! And the draw became chaos. Men hauling litters, dragging each other, cramming into the tight cover behind the rock shelf. And Walker stood at the mouth of it, counting heads, always counting. Heads, and out on the valley road the truck came into view. And it was worse than Daniel had said, because mounted on the back was a heavy machine gun already traversing toward them. And behind it, packed in the bed, a dozen fighters in the truck slewed to a halt at the perfect distance. Close enough for the gun to reach far enough to be safe from anything the Rangers had left. And the gunner racked the weapon and swung it toward the mouth of the draw, where Ethan Walker was still standing, still counting, and there was no time left for anyone to reach the shelf who wasn't already there. 2 minutes up on the ridge, Madison threw herself prone. Her lungs were on fire. Her hands were shaking from the climb, actually shaking for the first time in the whole night, because you cannot sprint up a mountain and then hold a rifle perfectly still. The body doesn't work that way, and she needed it still in the next 15 seconds, or 22 men died. She pressed herself into the rock, and she did the thing she had trained 10,000 hours to do, the thing that had made her a legend before they made her a lie. She took the chaos in her body and she reached into it, and she started shutting it down system by system, breath by breath, forcing her heart rate down through sheer will, forcing her hands quiet. And it was the hardest thing she had ever done, because she had never had less time and never needed more. Down in the valley, the gunner opened fire. The heavy rounds tore into the mouth of the draw, and Walker threw himself backward behind the shelf a half second before the space he'd been standing in disintegrated, and the men crammed into the cover felt the whole rock shelf shudder as the gun walked its fire across it, searching. And everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the truck repositioned to a spot where the shelf didn't cover them, and there was nothing. Nothing they could do but press themselves into the stone and wait to find out if the ghost on the mountain could do it one more time. Up on the ridge, Madison found the truck in the scope. 1,200 meters. A stranger's rifle, a stranger's zero. A heavy crosswind she was reading off the dust the gun was kicking up. And a target that any second now was going to shift position and start killing the men behind that shelf. She had 1 round to learn the zero. 1. She could not spend it on the gunner. If she fired at the gunner to test her zero and missed, she'd give away her position and her correction, both, and by the time she adjusted, the truck would reposition and it would be over. No, she had to spend her sighter on something that didn't matter, learn the correction, and then take the gunner with the second round, all before the truck moved. 2 shots, the first to learn, the second to kill, and maybe 4 seconds to do both. She picked the front tire. She breathed out. She held. And in the half second of stillness at the bottom of the breath, the whole world went quiet the way it always had for her. The way it had that first day at Benning, 15 years ago, when a jealous young officer named Bradley Vance had watched her and understood he'd never be that good. The battlefield fell away, the fear fell away, the 7 years fell away, and there was only the target and the wind and the round. She fired. The truck's front tire blew apart, and the vehicle lurched down and sideways, and in that lurch, that half second of the gunner grabbing for balance as his platform dropped, Madison read exactly how much the wind had pushed her round, adjusted, worked the bolt, and fired again before the gunner recovered. The gunner dropped. The heavy machine gun went silent. And down in the draw, 22 men heard the gun stop and then heard a full second later the flat crack rolling down from the ridge. And they knew, every one of them knew, that she was back on the mountain and that she was not going to let them die. But it wasn't over. The dozen fighters in the truck bed were pouring out of it now, spreading into the rocks along the road. And they had rifles, and they were between the Rangers and the extraction point, and the ghost on the mountain had how many rounds left in a stranger's magazine? Not enough. Not for 12 men in cover. And she couldn't hold the whole valley alone forever. She'd already proven that once tonight, which was exactly why 30 seconds earlier she'd done the other thing. The thing nobody had seen. Because when Madison Carter had reached the top of the ridge before she went prone in the 2 seconds she had spare, she had keyed Rhea's team net, the one she now held, because she held Rhea's rifle, and his radio was clipped to it, and she had said 6 words into it fast and low: Reyes, QRF, push them, now. And Staff Sergeant Reyes, down in the draw, had understood and had gotten on his own backup radio and done the one thing a legend on a mountain couldn't do from behind a rifle. He'd worked the net. He'd found the QRF 40 minutes out, and he'd told them what was happening in words that made 40 minutes unacceptable. And somewhere out in the dark, a flight of aircraft that had been socked in by weather had just gotten a break in the ceiling, and a reason worth risking it for. The fighters spilling out of the truck never heard the helicopters coming. The weather masked the sound until the last second, and then the sky opened up above the valley road, and the gap in the clouds that had trapped everyone all night became the gap that two attack helicopters came screaming through, and the 12 fighters in the rocks discovered that the ghost on the mountain had never been fighting alone at all. She'd been buying time the way she'd been buying time all night. And the time she'd bought had finally run out for the enemy instead of for the Rangers. It was over in 90 seconds. And in the sudden ringing silence that followed, Ethan Walker crawled out from behind the rock shelf, stood up on legs that barely held him, looked up at the dark ridge line where he knew she was lying, and keyed his radio. "Overwatch," he said. His voice broke on the word. "Whoever you are, whatever they said about you, you just saved every man I've got. Twice." He had to stop. He had to breathe. "I don't have the words. There aren't words. But I am never going to forget your name as long as I live. Captain Madison Carter. You hear me, never." Up on the ridge, Madison lowered the rifle. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her heart had slowed. The valley below her was quiet, and the helicopters were settling toward the extraction point, and 22 men were going home. She keyed the radio one last time, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and level and carried 7 years of everything in it. "Just finishing a job," she said, "that some people thought I couldn't do anymore." 10,000 miles away in a command center where 40 officers stood frozen around a drone feed, that transmission came through the speakers clear and calm, and every person in that room heard it. And Colonel Bradley Vance heard it too. He heard the voice of the woman he had erased, calm and alive and victorious, speaking to a Ranger captain who had just sworn to tell the whole world her name. He heard it come through the speakers into a room full of witnesses. He heard the recording light glowing red on the console, and he understood finally and completely that the thing he had spent 7 years building, the lie, the silence, the buried truth, the career built on top of a soldier's grave, had just been blown apart by the same rifle that had saved those Rangers. Because Madison Carter hadn't just saved 22 men tonight. She'd made sure that saving them was so big, so public, so undeniable, so wrapped in witnesses and recordings and Ranger oaths, that the lie could never contain it. She hadn't just won the battle. She'd made her own resurrection impossible to bury. Daniel Hayes turned from the feed and looked at Vance across the silent room. And this time he didn't lower his voice at all. This time he wanted them all to hear. 22 Rangers, Daniel said. 40 witnesses. A recorded feed. A signals log with your voice on it saying, "Let them die." He let each one land like a round. And the soldier who saved them is a captain you personally discharged for cowardice 7 years ago. He shook his head slowly. "You had one job tonight, Bradley. Coordinate a rescue. And instead, you handed Madison Carter the one thing you spent 7 years making sure she'd never have." He paused. "Proof." Vance opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because there was nothing to say. And for the first time in 7 years, Colonel Bradley Vance understood that the woman he'd thrown away had just thrown him, and that everything from this moment forward was going to be the sound of that lie coming apart one truth at a time in front of the whole world. Anna Reyes told her everything. It took 2 hours. Madison sat on the edge of that hotel bed and did not move, and did not interrupt. And she listened to a young sergeant unspool 3 years of doubt, 3 years of being told she was the problem, 3 years of a smaller, quieter version of the exact machine that had been built to bury Madison herself. And when Anna finally ran out of words, when the story was all the way out, and there was nothing left but the raw place underneath it, Madison said the only thing that mattered. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "You were right. You were right 3 years ago, and they needed you to be wrong, so they made you feel crazy because that's cheaper than admitting the truth. I know that feeling in my bones, Anna. I lived inside it for 7 years. And I am telling you, soldier to soldier, that the thing they broke in you, the part that stopped trusting itself, that part was never broken. They just told you it was." There was a long silence on the line. Then a sound, small and cracked, the sound of someone who has been holding something for 3 years, finally allowed to set it down. "I didn't think anybody would ever say that to me," Anna whispered. "Somebody just did," Madison said. "And you're going to say it to the next one. Because there's always a next one. That's the part they count on, that we stay quiet, that we stay ashamed, that we never find each other. Well, we found each other. So here is what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to make some calls. The same people who reopened my case are going to hear your name. You are not going to walk into that room alone the way I did. You're going to walk in with me, and with a ranger captain who owes me a favor and would burn down a building if I asked him to, and with the whole ugly proven record of what these people do to soldiers who tell the truth." She paused. "You reported it by the book once and they broke you for it. This time we do it my way. Loud, in front of witnesses, where they can't bury it." She heard Anna start to cry, and this time it wasn't grief. It was relief. It was the specific, overwhelming relief of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, discovering all at once that they don't have to carry it alone anymore. And Madison, sitting in the dark with Walker's worn captain's bars pressed into her palm, understood something that reframed the entire 7 years she'd spent believing she'd lost everything. She hadn't been discarded. She'd been forged. Everything they'd done to her, the erasure, the silence, the years in the wilderness, teaching accountants to hold a pistol of it, had made her into exactly the person Ana Reyes needed on the other end of that phone tonight. A person who knew the feeling from the inside. A person who couldn't be told she didn't understand. A person who had walked all the way through the fire they were still standing in and come out the other side with her name intact. If they'd never buried her, she'd never have been the one to dig somebody else out. She didn't sleep that night. But it wasn't the old sleeplessness, the 7 years kind, the kind that came from a wound that wouldn't close. It was a different kind entirely. It was the sleeplessness of someone who has just realized what the rest of their life is for. The next morning, she made the calls. The lead investigator from her own case, the hard man who'd had to look down at his papers when she talked about the people Vance hurt after her, took her call on the second ring, and when she told him about Ana Reyes, there was a silence on the line, and then he said quietly, "I told you we were still determining how many people got hurt in those 7 years. This is what determining looks like, Captain. They start coming forward. One tells another it's safe, and that one tells another." A pause. "You cracked something open. I don't think you understand yet how big it's going to get." He was right. She didn't understand yet, but she was about to, because Ana Reyes was not the last phone call. Over the next 3 weeks they came. Slowly at first, then in a rush, the same way the officers in that command center had come forward once one of them broke the silence. A warrant officer from Fort Bragg, a supply sergeant who'd reported fraud and been quietly ruined for it, a young lieutenant who'd been told in almost the exact words Madison had heard that she was a talented soldier who couldn't handle the pressure. Some of them had crossed paths with Vance directly. Most of them hadn't. They'd been broken by the same system that had protected Vance, the same reflex to close ranks, the same machinery that found it easier to destroy the person telling the truth than to face the truth itself. They found Madison because Madison's story had gone around the world, and in her story they recognized their own, and in her restored name they saw for the first time the possibility that their names could be restored too. She answered at every single one. She sat at that same kitchen table in Colorado she'd flown home by then, back to the little house at the foot of the mountains, and she took the calls one after another, and to each of them she said a version of the same thing she'd said to Anna. "It wasn't your fault. You were right. You're not alone anymore." And she connected them to the investigators and to Walker, who had appointed himself, without being asked, the loudest advocate any of them could have wanted, and to each other, so that the ones who'd been carrying it alone for years suddenly had a network of people who understood. Daniel called her one evening in the middle of it. "You know what you've built, don't you?" he said. "I haven't built anything," Madison said. "I just answer the phone." "You've built the thing that should have existed for you 7 years ago," Daniel said. "The thing that wasn't there when you needed it. When you reported it, there was nobody. No network, no advocate, no other voice saying, 'I believe you.' You were one soldier against a wall, and the wall won because that's what walls do to one soldier." His voice was rough. "And now there's a whole line of people who don't have to be one soldier against a wall because you turned around and became the thing you needed. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Most people who get hurt the way you got hurt spend the rest of their lives just trying to stop hurting. You spent yours making sure it stops hurting other people." Madison was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't decide to," she said finally. "It just, Anna called, and I couldn't not answer, and then the next one called, and I couldn't not answer that one either." She looked out the window at the dark shape of the mountains. "Daniel, can I tell you something I've never told anybody? Always, For 7 years, I thought the worst thing they took from me was my career, my rank, my name. And I was wrong. The worst thing they took was the belief that any of it mattered, that doing the right thing mattered. Because I did the right thing, I reported it exactly the way I was trained, and doing the right thing got me destroyed. And after that, I stopped believing the right thing was worth doing because look what it cost. I taught hunting safety, and I kept my head down, and I told myself the world was just like that telling the truth was for suckers, that the people who win are the people who lie. She swallowed. And then you called me about that mountain, and I said yes. And I didn't even know why I said yes. But I know now I said yes because some part of me needed to find out if the right thing was still worth doing, if I still had it in me. And it turned out I did. And now every phone call, every one of these people, every time I answer, I'm proving it to myself all over again. That it matters, that it was always worth it, that they took a lot from me, but they never got that. There was a long silence on the line. When Daniel spoke, his voice was unsteady. When I trained you, he said, I used to tell the other instructors that the thing that made you the best wasn't the shooting. Everybody thought it was the shooting, the stillness, the wind reading all of it. But that wasn't it. He paused. It was that you never flinched from the truth, not once in all the years I knew you. Everybody flinches, eventually. Everybody finds the truth that's too expensive and looks away. You never did. It's why you were the best sniper I ever trained. And it's why they had to bury you, because a person who won't flinch from the truth is the single most dangerous thing in the world to people who are lying. His voice thickened. They didn't bury you because you were weak Madison. They buried you because you were the strongest person in the building and they couldn't control you. That's the truth of it. That's the truth I should have said out loud 7 years ago in that hearing room, and I didn't, and I'll regret my silence until I die. A breath. But I'm saying it now, and I'm going to keep saying it to anyone who'll listen for as long as I've got. Madison closed her eyes. You already made it right, she said quietly. You made it right the night you picked up the phone and called a discharged sniper about a mountain in Afghanistan. You could have called anybody. You could have let those men die and kept your hands clean. You didn't. You called me. You gave me back my life, Daniel, and you didn't even know that's what you were doing. You thought you were saving 22 Rangers. You were, but you were also saving me. She opened her eyes. So we're square. You hear me? 7 years is enough. Put it down. She heard the old man breathe out, long and shaking, and she knew he'd been carrying that guilt every single day for 7 years, the same way she'd been carrying her wound, and she knew that in that moment on that phone call, he finally set it down. The court-martial of Bradley Vance began 2 months later. Madison went. She hadn't been sure she would. She'd told herself for weeks that she didn't need to see it, that the man was beside the point, that she'd already gotten everything that mattered. But when the day came, she found herself putting on the dress uniform she was entitled to wear again, the uniform with captain's bars on it, real ones, now official ones. And she found herself driving to the courthouse, and she found herself sitting in the gallery, and she understood that she hadn't come for Vance at all. She'd come for the ones who couldn't, because the gallery was full. It was full of the people who'd called her over the last months, Anna Reyes and the warrant officer from Bragg, and the ruined supply sergeant, and the young lieutenant, and a dozen others, and they had come the way the Rangers had come to her hearing, from all over on their own time, because for every one of them, this was their reckoning too. Vance himself had only directly wronged a handful of them, but he'd become, over these months, the face of the thing that had wronged all of them, the machine, the reflex, the wall. And watching that face finally answer for it in a court of law was, for every person in that gallery, a kind of medicine they'd waited years for. Madison sat among them, not in front, not as the hero, just one of them, one more soldier who told the truth and paid for it in a gallery full of soldiers who told the truth and paid for it. And there was a strength in that, in not being alone, that she would not have traded for any amount of individual glory. Vance looked older than she remembered, smaller. When they brought him in and he saw the gallery, saw how full it was, saw all those faces, understood in one glance that this was not one soldier against a wall anymore, but a whole wall of soldiers against him. Something in his face collapsed. He'd built his whole life on the certainty that the ones he broke would stay broken, stay quiet, stay alone. And here they all were in one room, unbroken together, watching. At one point, during a recess, he passed near where Madison was sitting. He stopped. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other, the woman he'd erased and the man who'd erased her, and the whole gallery went quiet watching. "You could have let them die," Vance said low just to her, "on that mountain. You could have said no and let them die, and I'd have gone down for it, and you'd have had your revenge. Cleaner than this. Why didn't you?" And Madison looked at the small, ruined man who had cost her 7 years, and she felt at last the thing she'd wondered for months whether she'd feel. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't even anger, it was something closer to pity, and underneath the pity, a kind of freedom. "Because I'm not you," she said simply. "That's the whole answer. You'd have let them die to protect yourself. You proved that on a recorded line. I'd never let them die to punish you. And the difference between those two things, Bradley, that's the difference between us. That's the difference you spent 7 years trying to erase and couldn't because it was never on any piece of paper you could sign. It was in me. It's always been in me." She held his eyes. "You threw me away because you couldn't stand that I was better than you at the one thing you cared about. But that was never really the shooting. It was that. Right there. And you knew it. That's why you had to bury me so deep." Vance opened his mouth. Nothing came out. There was nothing to say, and for the first time in his life, standing in front of the woman he'd destroyed and failed to destroy, Bradley Vance understood that he had lost something far larger than a court-martial. He'd lost the argument he'd been making to himself for 7 years, the argument that he'd had to do it, that she'd left him no choice, that it was her fault for being too loud, too right, too dangerous. That argument had let him sleep at night, and she'd just taken it from him in a hallway in 11 quiet sentences, and now he'd have to sleep the rest of his life without it. He was convicted on nearly every count. The sentence was severe, and when it was read, the gallery did not cheer because these were soldiers, and soldiers don't cheer in a courtroom, but a sound moved through them all the same, a long, low exhale, the sound of a great many people setting down a weight they'd carried alone for years and discovering they could finally stand up straight. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, Anna Reyes found her. "I don't know how to thank you," Anna said. "Don't thank me," Madison said. "There's a next one coming. There's always a next one. Somewhere out there right now, there's a soldier who reported something and got told they were the problem, and they're sitting alone, thinking they're crazy, thinking maybe they really were wrong, and someday they're going to find their way to one of us." She put her hand on the young sergeant's shoulder. "And when they do, you're going to answer the phone. That's how you thank me. You answer the phone, and you tell them it wasn't their fault, and you tell them they're not alone. That's the whole thing, Anna. That's the whole job now. It's the same as it ever was. It's about the person next to you. Everything else is just paperwork." Anna nodded, and her eyes were wet, and she understood that she'd just been handed something, not a debt, but a duty, the good kind, the kind you carry gladly. And Madison Carter walked down the courthouse steps into a life that no longer belonged to the life. A captain again, a soldier again, her name her own again, but changed permanently by the 7 years in the dark. She'd gone up that mountain to save 22 men. She'd come down having found out what she was going to save for the rest of her life. The ones the wall broke, the ones left alone, the ones still waiting somewhere for a phone to ring and a voice to say the words nobody had said to her for 7 long years. "I believe you. It wasn't your fault. You're not alone." She had waited her whole life to become the person who could say them. And now she'd never stop. The letter came 4 months after the court-martial, and it changed everything again. It arrived at the little house in Colorado in a plain government envelope, and Madison almost set it aside with the rest of the mail, because by then she'd learned to be careful with official envelopes. They'd broken her heart before. But something made her open this one, standing right there at the kitchen table, and she read it twice before she let herself believe it, and then she sat down slowly because her legs weren't steady. The United States Army was formally inviting Captain Madison Carter to return to Fort Carson. Not as a curiosity, not as a symbol, as an instructor. They wanted her to build and run a sniper program, her methods, her standards, her name on the door. And there was a second paragraph, and the second paragraph was the one that made her hands shake, because it said that in light of the investigation her case had triggered, the Army was establishing something new, a formal channel for soldiers reporting misconduct up the chain with protections built in with advocates assigned, with oversight that answered to no single commander. And they wanted her involved in shaping it, They wanted the woman the system had broken to help build the thing that would keep it from breaking anyone else the same way. She read that paragraph a third time and a fourth. Then she called Daniel. "They want me back at Carson," she said before he'd even finished saying hello. "The same place, Daniel. The same place where my name disappeared. They want me to teach, and they want me to help build a reporting system so what happened to me can't happen the same way again." There was a silence on the line. Then Daniel said carefully, "How do you feel about it?" And that was the real question, wasn't it? Because Fort Carson was not just a base to her, it was the place where it had ended. It was the parking lot where she'd stood with a cardboard box and a discharge that called her a coward. It was the ground where they'd erased her. And now they were asking her to walk back onto that ground and stand in front of young soldiers as the very thing they'd told the whole world she wasn't. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to say no. Part of me thinks, why would I go back to the place that did this to me? Let them find somebody else. I've got a life here. I've got the calls, the people, the Anna and the others. I don't need Fort Carson." "That's true," Daniel said. "You don't need it. So the question isn't whether you need it." A pause. "The question is whether there's a 19-year-old showing up at Carson next month who needs you." And that landed the way Daniel's words always landed, right in the center of her, because it was exactly the right question and she'd been avoiding it. She thought about Cole Dawson, 19 years old, a goodbye letter in his pocket, certain he was going to die on a mountain. She thought about all the Cole Dawsons who'd come through Fort Carson after her, the ones who'd only ever heard the rumor, the failed sniper, the woman who broke the cautionary tale. She thought about what it would mean for those kids to have that lie replaced in person by the truth, to be trained by her, to hear from the source the real story, and to carry it forward instead of the fake one. "You already know I'm going to say yes," she said quietly. "I know," Daniel said, and she could hear him smiling. "I've known since before I called, but you needed to get there yourself." She went back to Fort Carson on a cold morning in early spring, and the drive onto the base was the strangest thing she had ever done. Every landmark was a wound. The gate where she'd shown her ID for the last time 7 years ago. The road she'd driven out on with a box in the passenger seat and her whole life in pieces. She'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the bad years, always as a fantasy of triumph marching back in, vindicated. And now that it was real, it didn't feel like triumph at all. It felt like walking back into a house where something terrible had happened and finding to her surprise that the house couldn't hurt her anymore. Because she wasn't the same person who'd been driven out of it. That was the thing she understood as she drove through that gate. They'd erased Captain Madison Carter 7 years ago. But the woman driving back in was somebody they'd never met. Somebody the 7 years in the dark had made somebody who had reached down off a mountain and saved 22 men and then turned around and started saving everyone the wall had broken. Fort Carson had cast out a soldier. It was getting back something much harder to erase. Word had spread, of course. By the time she arrived, everyone on that base knew the story. The rumor that had followed her for 7 years, the failed sniper, the coward, had been replaced completely by the truth, and the truth had spread through the barracks and the mess halls. The same way the lie once had, except this time it was true, and this time it made her a legend instead of a warning. The young soldiers didn't know what to do with her at first. They'd grown up on the story. Some of them had heard the old version, the cautionary tale, before the truth came out, and they looked at her the way you look at someone from a myth, half afraid, not sure she was real. Others had only ever known the true version, the sniper on the mountain, and they looked at her with something close to awe. Either way, none of them knew how to just talk to her, and for the first few days she felt at the distance, the weight of the story standing between her and the people she'd come to teach. She broke it on the range, because the first day she took a class out to the range, one of the young soldiers, cocky, talented, the kind of kid who'd been the best shot in every room he'd ever been in, and knew it, made a comment under his breath. Not quite loud enough to be a challenge, just loud enough. Something about how he'd believe all the stories when he saw it with his own eyes. Madison heard it. She didn't get angry. She didn't even turn around right away. She just finished what she was saying to the class, and then she walked over to the kid and she said, "What's your name, specialist?" "Torres, ma'am." "You're a good shot, Torres. I've watched you. You're probably the best shot in this class." She let that sit for a second, watched him almost smile. "And you want to know if the stories are true. That's fair. I would too in your boots." She nodded toward the far end of the range, toward a target set at a distance that made the whole class go quiet just looking at it. A distance. Nobody on that range shot at a distance that was frankly ridiculous. Set me up a target down there. And then watch. Not the target, watch me. Because the thing you need to learn isn't in the target, Torres. It's in what a person does before the shot. Everybody can be taught to pull a trigger. What I'm going to teach you is what happens in the 10 seconds before. She lay down behind the rifle, and the whole class gathered around, and the cocky kid watched, and Madison Carter did the thing that 15 years and 7 years in the dark and one impossible mountain had made her the best in the world at doing. She went still. She read a wind nobody else could read. She breathed out slow, and in the half second of quiet at the bottom of the breath, she made a shot that none of them would forget for the rest of their lives. A shot that made the cocky kid's mouth fall open. A shot that answered every question anybody would ever have about whether the stories were true. Then she stood up, handed Torres the rifle and said, "Now let me teach you how to do that. Not the shot, the stillness. The shot's just what happens when the stillness is real." And that was the day Fort Carson stopped seeing a legend and started seeing a teacher. She was good at it, better than she'd expected. It turned out that everything that had made her a great sniper, the patience, the stillness, the ability to see 3 moves ahead, the refusal to flinch, made her an extraordinary instructor. And the young soldiers who came through her program came out different than the ones who went through anyone else's. Not just better shots, better soldiers. Because she taught them the thing underneath the shooting. The thing Daniel had once said was the real reason she was the best. She taught them not to flinch from the truth. She'd start every new class the same way. She'd stand in front of them and she'd tell them who she was. All of it, the rumor and the truth both. She'd tell them the Army had once called her a coward and erased her name. She'd tell them why. And then she'd tell them the thing she most wanted them to carry. Your uniform doesn't define your worth, she'd say. Your rank doesn't define it. Your record doesn't define it, because I'm living proof a record can be a lie. The only thing that defines a soldier is what you do when everything's taken away and there's no reward left for doing the right thing. She'd look at them one by one. I found that out the hard way. I hope you never have to. But if you ever do, if you ever end up standing alone, having told a truth that cost you everything, thinking maybe you were the one who was wrong, I want you to remember that there was a captain who stood where you're standing and told you it happens and it's survivable. And being broken by people who couldn't handle your integrity is not the same thing as being weak. It's the opposite. Remember that. It might be the most important thing I ever teach you. And they remembered it, all of them, because she was standing in front of them as the proof. The calls never stopped either. Even as she built the program, even as she trained class after class, the phone kept ringing as soldiers their wall had broken, finding their way to her one after another, the way they had since the night Ana Reyes first called. And now she had more to offer them than just her own voice. The reporting channel she'd helped build was real now, up and running, staffed with advocates. And every soldier who called her afraid and alone got connected to something that hadn't existed when she'd needed it. She'd become the front door to the thing she'd spent 7 years wishing had existed. Ana Reyes had a hand in it too. Her case had been resolved fully in her favor. The officer who'd broken her held to account. And instead of leaving the Army, which she'd been ready to do, she'd stayed and she'd asked to help run the very channel that had saved her. She and Madison talked almost every week. They'd become, over the months, something like family, the specific family of people who've survived the same fire. You know what the strangest part is, Ana said one evening on the phone. I spent 3 years wishing none of it had ever happened to me, wishing I just kept my mouth shut. And now I wouldn't trade it, because if it hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't be able to do this. I wouldn't understand the soldiers who call. I wouldn't know what to say to them. A pause. You did that to me, you know. You showed me the whole thing could turn into something instead of just being a wound. I didn't do it, Madison said. You did. I just answered the phone the night you needed somebody to. And now I'm the one answering the phone. That's the whole thing, Madison said softly. That's how it works. That's the only way it ever works. Somebody reaches back for the next one. It's the same as the Mountain Ana. It was always the same as the mountain. It's about the person next to you. Everything else is just paperwork. A year to the day after the mountain, they held a ceremony. Madison hadn't wanted it. She'd fought it actually right up until the moment Ethan Walker called her and told her in the flat, immovable Ranger word voice she'd learned not to argue with that she was going to stand there and accept it, whether she liked it or not, because it wasn't for her. It was for the 22 men who needed to give it to her. So she stood there. They came from all over again, the way they'd come to the hearing, the way they'd come to the court-martial. All 22 of them, the whole element she'd saved in dress uniform, including the ones who'd been too badly wounded to make the earlier gatherings healed, now walking, now alive, now. Cole Dawson, a full year older, no longer a shaking boy, but a young man who carried himself differently, who'd re-upped, who'd told everyone who'd listened that he was still in the Army because a soldier the Army had thrown away had refused to let him die. Ryan Mitchell. Emily Brooks, who'd left the field, but stayed a medic training the next generation, saying she couldn't do the job anymore, but she could damn well teach it. All of them. And Daniel was there. Older, slower, but standing straight, watching the woman he'd trained receive the thing he'd known she deserved for 7 years. The award itself almost didn't matter to her. What mattered was the moment before it, when Walker stood up to speak, and instead of the citation, instead of the official words, he set the paper down and just talked. A year ago, Walker said, "I stood on a mountain and decided my men were going to die. I'd run out of options. I'd run out of hope. And I made the hardest call a commander makes, which is deciding not to break your men with false hope in their last hour. I told my sergeant not to tell them help was coming because I didn't believe it was, and I wasn't going to let them die hoping." He stopped. His jaw worked. I was wrong, and I have spent every day of the last year grateful down to my bones that I was wrong. Because help was coming. Help had been coming for hours from 10,000 miles away in the person of a captain this Army had told the whole world was a coward. He turned and looked at Madison. "I've thought a lot this year about what that word means. Coward. And I've decided I know exactly what it means now, because I've seen its opposite. Its opposite is a soldier who has every reason on earth to say no, who's been discarded, lied about, erased, left with nothing, and who gets on a plane anyway and flies across the world and lies down in the cold and the dark and saves 22 strangers who never did anything for her, for no reward, for no recognition she could count on, for nothing but the fact that it was the right thing to do." His voice broke, and he didn't try to hide it. "That's not a coward. That's the bravest soldier I have ever served alongside, and I have served alongside some brave ones. Captain Carter, on behalf of 22 men who are alive because of you and the families who still have them, thank you. We are your brothers for the rest of our lives. All you ever have to do is call." And then the 22 of them stood, and they saluted her the same way they had in the hearing room a year before. And this time Madison didn't fight the tears, and this time neither did anyone else. That evening, after everyone had gone, Madison walked out alone to the edge of the base, out to where you could see the mountains. And she stood there for a long time in the cold. Daniel found her there. He came up beside her, slow, and for a while neither of them said anything the way they'd once sat in silence at the beginning of everything. "You did it," Daniel said finally. "You got it all back. Your name, your rank. More than that, you got the truth back out in the open where everybody could see it. Most people never get that. Most people who get buried the way you got buried, they stay buried." He shook his head. "You didn't just come back, Madison. You came back and turned the whole thing into something, the program, the reporting channel, all those soldiers you've caught before they hit the ground. That's more than a career, that's a legacy." Madison was quiet, looking at the mountains. "You want to know the truth," she said. "The thing I never told anyone, always. For 7 years, I thought about revenge, every day. I imagined Vance's face when the truth came out. I imagined making him admit it. I told myself that was what I wanted to be proven right, to see them all have to say they were wrong about me." She paused, and then it all happened. Every bit of it. I got the vindication. I got the reckoning. Vance is in prison. My record's clean. And you know what I found out? She turned to look at him. It didn't fill the hole. Not even a little. The day Vance was convicted, I felt almost nothing, because it turned out that was never the thing I actually needed. "What was this?" Madison said simply, and she gestured not at anything specific, but at all of it. The base, the program, the soldiers, the mountains, the whole shape of the life she'd built out of the wreckage. Being useful again, being the person who catches the next one before they fall. It turns out you can't heal a wound like mine by getting even. You can only heal it by making sure it doesn't happen to somebody else. Revenge is just standing still and looking backward. But reaching back for the next person, that's the only thing that ever actually moved me forward. She looked at the mountains a while longer. They tried to erase me, Daniel. They took my rank and my name and 7 years of my life, and they tried to make me disappear. And the thing they never understood, the thing people like Vance never understand, is that you can erase a record. You can erase a name off a piece of paper, but you cannot erase what a person is. What I am was never in the file they gutted. It was never in the rank they stripped. It was in me the whole time. And the day they threw me away, they didn't destroy it. They just set it loose. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They made a mistake, Madison said quietly, and there was no anger in it anymore, only certainty. When they threw me away, they thought they were getting rid of a problem. What they actually did was create the one person who would spend the rest of her life making sure their whole way of doing things never worked again. Every soldier I catch, every truth teller who doesn't get buried because the channel I helped build caught them first. Every kid in my program who learns that integrity is strength and not a weakness. That's all of it, every bit of it, because they threw me away. She almost smiled. You threw me away. Bad move. That's what I told the man who signed my discharge the night I left for that mountain. I didn't fully understand what I meant when I said it. I do now. It was the worst move he ever made, because the soldier he threw away became the one thing he could never take back and never bury and never erase. The mountain stood dark against the last of the light, and Madison Carter stood in front of them in a uniform that was hers again, a captain, again a legend. Now not for the shot she'd made, but for what she'd built out of everything they tried to take. They had stripped her rank, and she had earned it back. They had erased her name, and she had made it impossible to forget. They had called her a coward, and she had answered by saving 22 men and then 100 more they'd never even hear about. They had thrown away a soldier, believing a soldier was a title, a record, a line in a file. They had forgotten the one thing that mattered. A true warrior is not made by a title. A true warrior is revealed the day everything is taken away, the rank, the name, the reward, the reason, and they choose with nothing left to gain to protect the person next to them anyway. Madison Carter had chosen. On a mountain in the dark with nothing left to gain, and she would go on choosing it one soldier at a time for the rest of her life. The army had tried to erase her. Instead, they had created the one legend they could never bury, and her name, the name they swore no one would remember, is spoken today by every soldier she ever saved, every soldier she ever taught, and every soldier who ever picked up a phone alone and afraid and heard a steady voice on the other end say the words she had waited her whole life to be the one to say. I believe you. It wasn't your fault. You are not alone. That is the soldier they threw away. That is the warrior they could never replace. And that is a name the United States Army will never, ever forget again.